Hello, Mark. It's a pleasure to see you here at Money 2020. What brings you here at this conference?
Well, it's the place to be, right? With ClearBank, we are in the payments embedded banking space. Money 2020 is one of those must-see, must-attend events where lots of clients, prospective clients are, and to get involved in the conversation. I just come from a panel on building the next decacorn. Yeah, it's a great event, and I'm pleased to be here.
Your session opens with the fact that fintech cannot grow, cannot change anymore. But big players did this. So what's changed?
So I think it's sort of how do fintechs really reach the next level? I think we've had a load of success, right? So you just need to look at Revolut, for example, as being a really UK success story of fintech, and they've expanded globally. And have reached a huge amount of scale. I think if you go back 10 years, I think what wasn't available at the time then was the infrastructure players that are available now, like ClearBank. So I think the fintechs had to build their own infrastructure, build their own scale. I think the market was a bit more forgiving back then. Capital was much more plentiful. And I think if you compare that to now, I think there are some infrastructure players like ClearBank that will help fintechs scale. But access to capital is getting a little bit more tricky. And I think if you really want to reach that decacorn kind of status and be a big player on the likes of Revolut and others, you've got to be going global, right? And to go global, you need access to capital. And while the UK is very good at the startup phase and is getting better at the scale-up phase, what we're not good at is funding that later in life of a business. So I think that's the challenge that exists today is once you've gone through a few rounds of funding, where does the next capital come from?
There are people in the market, and here at the conference also heard this, that embedded finance is not a quiet zone anymore. Well, I still have some doubts about this, but big players are proving that embedded finance is really, ongoing and on move. Like, I don't know, Stripe is moving to a banking license, JP Morgan embeds fintech companies into their infrastructure and ecosystem, so on. So in this manner, what ClearBank do that makes you up in the next 18 months ahead of your competitors?
There's still relatively few players in the market, but there's a few more now than there were a couple of years ago. And I think that's a good thing. I think competition in the market drives better outcomes for everybody. And I think it also proves that there is a market for what we're doing. ClearBank were first in the UK to do it, and it's actually a positive thing to see others coming into the market. I think, though, if you look at the sort of moat around embedded banking, if you think about what you've got to be a regulated bank, you've got to build the technology, you've got to have direct access to the payment schemes, you've got to have a scalable business, you've got to have a brand that is trusted, and you can't build all of those things in 18 months. And then you've got all of the different products that we've built, the capabilities we've built, the fact that we're operating in the UK with a regulated bank and the EU with a regulated bank. Again, there's no one really doing that at the scale that we're doing at. So there's a lot that can't be replicated quickly. I think there are some that are trying, and it took us a long time to get to this point. I think it'll take others a while too. And it's not just about building the tech. The tech has got to be industry leading, cloud native, API first, and you've got to have the trusted brand, because banking is ultimately a confidence game. And if you haven't got the brand, if you haven't got the trust, you haven't got the proven track record of scalability, it's going to be really difficult to compete.
In your panel, you're mentioning that for scale, there is need for infrastructure and there's need for money. And now you mentioned also about the trust. So infrastructure is you can build, trust you can gain, but with money, UK, and not only UK, even European and North American market is quite brute in the topic of investments for the last few years, because different players are starting to embed different companies, there appeared new niches and so on. But at the same time, where do you think the next, 10 billion euros or dollars will go into? What specific niche of fintech will go? Or maybe you think there are some companies who, small, medium, or big players who will attract the next $10 billion in UK specifically?
Yeah, so there's a few parts to that. I think the first part is, I think The UK, in terms of capital, it's not as good as it used to be.
Yeah.
But the UK is still number 2 in the world for investment into fintech, and that's a real positive. I think that's it used to be equal to the whole of Europe combined. Now I think it's sort of equal or slightly above the top 2 in Europe. So the advantage that the UK had on capital raising isn't quite as it was, but we're still number 2 in the world. I think we're very good at funding startups and smaller ticket sizes. I think where it gets more difficult is once you get to a scale where you're on your way to that decacorn business, it gets a lot more tricky to find someone willing to invest. So we don't necessarily have the risk appetite that the kind of larger US, Canadian funds have, willing to fund growth rather than look for kind of annuitized cash flows. I think there's a difference in kind of risk appetite that we need to solve. Where does the next one come from? I think, if you step back and look at those that have achieved it, they are global by nature. They're internationally focused. They're focused on the client at the center of what they do. I mean, not to keep using Revolut as the example, but their client experience the customer experience is absolutely fantastic. They wrap around everything they do around the customer. That's really, really important. But they're also international. You look at Stripe International. There's lots of examples of it. They're not just sort of in one market. But there's also the next wave, I think, might look a bit different, is going to be much more kind of infrastructure plays, kind of an infrastructure play that can be scaled globally, that really gives the right kind of performance, real-time capability, operational scalability. So I think, that's going to be, I think, where the shift kind of comes to. It's going to have to be an AI-enabled business. Everything that's being built at the moment is AI first, AI enabled, AI native, and that's really going to be where the next one comes from.
And it's speaking about the future, what advice you'll give to financial institutions, banks, payment institutions, what they have to do or where they have to pay attention till next Money 2020?
I'd say two things, and I suspect they're a common theme in all the conversations that are taking place here today. One is AI first. You've got to adopt AI. You've got to have agentic workflows, because if you don't do it, others do it. The user experience gains, the operational efficiency gains, they're going to price you out the market. They're going to mean your proposition isn't competitive. But then also, if you look at where payment technology is moving to, we've just gone live in Europe with digital asset rails. So for EURC and very soon USDC, adoption of stablecoins to improve cross-border payment flows. Those would be the two things I think that between now and the next Money 2020, a year from now, that everyone here should be looking at.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for being here. It was a pleasure to discuss with you. And stay tuned. Bye-bye.
Thank you.